Brethren, it's my pleasure to see you all this evening. It's something which is quite emotional, seeing faces I haven't seen for almost 12 months. And many of you have come in from quite a distance away. I know Matthew's coming from Ambleside, and I think we've got brethren from provinces adjacent to Somerset as well, joining us on what is quite an eventful evening. And it's a huge pleasure to see what currently is about 172 members joining us this evening. Certainly the biggest Zoom meeting that I've ever been on, and I'm watching with interest. Do let me know after the meeting what you feel, if there's anything you enjoy about the meeting or ways we can do things better. Certainly keep an eye out. You've all got my email address, and I look forward to hearing from you. But without much further ado, I'd just like to welcome Tony to Somerset. He has been here before. He's got a tie to prove it, which he'll tell you about, and how he achieved the rank of a Somerset Master Mason's tie. And I would just hand over to Tony now and welcome you here today, and let's carry on with the show. Thank you very much.
Well, David, thank you very much indeed. And also Barry and Philip, thank you so much for your kind welcome and for sponsoring this event. I'm great. I feel greatly privileged to be invited back to Somerset to deliver these two talks. The last time I gave a talk in Somerset was to Somerset Masters Lodge on the 30th of October 2015, and that was my Prestonian lecture on scouting and Freemasonry. I'm sure some of you were there on that occasion, and it's good to see you again, brethren. So, brethren, thank you, as I say, for inviting me. Absolutely delighted to be back with you here in Somerset. And brethren and companions, as a regular contributor to Freemasonry's growing social media channels, I'm very concerned by the widespread misunderstanding about the links between what I consider to be the principal degrees in Freemasonry, which are, of course, the subject of this talk. And it seems to me that many brethren continue to confuse the true history of the degrees with their governance, the stories they tell, and the symbolic links between them. So the purpose of this talk is to resolve that confusion and provide a useful basis for cooperation between adherents of the degrees. Now, in this first part, I examine the historical and constitutional links. In the second part, which, as you've heard, is going to be delivered on the 17th of March, I will outline the narrative and symbolic links. So there's a clear distinction there, at least as far as the talks are concerned. So, brethren and companions, the relationship between the craft, mark, and Royal Arch, at least in England and Wales, and that's an important point. We're talking here about the situation in England and Wales, not the situation in other constitutions. But the relationship between them here all hinges on the Act of Union of 1813. And that was the instrument that formed the United Grand Lodge of England. The first sentence of the second article states, "It is declared and pronounced that pure ancient masonry consists of 3 degrees and no more. Those of the entered apprentice, the fellow craft, and the master mason, including the supreme order of the Holy Royal Arch." Now, the first thing to note is that the mark is not mentioned here, and I shall return to this point shortly. The second is that for many years, this declaration was interpreted to mean that the Royal Arch is part of the craft, although actually it doesn't say that. What it actually says is that the Royal Arch is included in something. Indeed, between 1834 and 2004, Royal Arch ritual described the Royal Arch as the completion of the Master Mason's degree. Yet both of them have all the well-known features of a complete degree structure, including, let's think about it, the admission, blessing, proving or testing, the obligation, entrusting with secrets, an explanation of the traditional history and moral lessons, and of course, the investiture of the new entrant. Now, brethren and companions, what more can you possibly expect from any degree ceremony? So any suggestion that the 3rd degree is not a complete degree is clearly wrong, and I think potentially frustrating to the newly raised brother, who would be quite justified in feeling cheated, or worse still, feeling that he might be considered an inferior or incomplete Freemason. The ambiguous wording of the second article has created confusion and misunderstanding for over 200 years. As early as 1843, the editor of the Freemasons' Quarterly Review suggested the entire system requires careful re-examination. In 2003, United Grand Lodge of England and Supreme Grand Chapter did just that. And since then, they no longer describe the Royal Arch as the completion of the third degree, and all reference to it being so was removed from the ritual in 2004 by edict. Today, United Grand Lodge of England and Supreme Grand Chapter consider the two orders of the Craft and the Royal Arch to be the two parts of an umbrella entity unique to our Constitution called pure ancient masonry. And we describe the Royal Arch as the completion of the journey that began with initiation. So it is pure ancient masonry that the Royal Arch is included within, not the Craft. Now, this position is fully supported by a close examination of the physical act of union. It is very clear that key parts of the sentence have been amended. Now, I've adjusted the contrast in this version of the slide, and I've indicated the altered words. And you may have seen a copy of this slide in the recent edition of Freemasonry Today in Jim Daniels' lecture. And incidentally, a version of this lecture is going to appear in the June edition of Freemasonry Today. In his Royal Arch Batham lecture, Douglas Burford suggested that the document, when signed, would originally have read as follows. It is declared and pronounced that pure ancient masonry consists of 4 degrees and no more, viz. Those of the entered apprentice, the fellow craft, the master mason, and also the supreme degree of the Holy Royal Arch. Now, the version that's come down to us through history has created confusion, but the original was unacceptable to the moderns, and I shall return to this point also. Perhaps part of the confusion today is also that when we use the term Royal Arch, we may at different times be referring to either the ceremony of exaltation, the status we gain as a Royal Arch Mason by completing that ceremony, and the name of a Masonic order. We sometimes get those three confused. Now, by creating an entity called pure ancient masonry, the Act of Union established an indissoluble link between the Craft and the Royal Arch in the English Constitution. From this stems the intertwined governance of the two orders. The Craft degrees are conferred in lodges under warrants issued by the United Grand Lodge of England, and the Royal Arch is conferred in Royal Arch chapters under charters issued by the Supreme Grand Chapter of England. Chapters are separate membership units, but each is attached to a Craft lodge and carries its number. The Grand Master is always the first Grand Principal if qualified to be so, and the Grand Secretary is also the Grand Scribee, again if so qualified. Members of the Craft Board of General Purposes serve on the Royal Arch's Committee of General Purposes and vice versa. Effectively, United Grand Lodge and Supreme Grand Chapter are interlinked. It's as if they're the two sides of the same coin. So what of the mark? The mark is not included in this system of pure ancient masonry. In the English Constitution, it is conferred in mark lodges under warrants issued by the independent and sovereign Grand Lodge of Mark Master Masons. But the situation is different in Scotland and Ireland. In both those cases, the mark is a qualifying degree that has to be taken before the Royal Arch, and in both cases, it can only be conferred on Master Masons. There is no indissoluble link between the Craft and the Royal Arch in Scotland or in Ireland, and their Supreme Grand Chapters are quite separate bodies. In both constitutions, their Supreme Grand Royal Arch Chapter governs the mark. In Scotland, the Supreme Grand Royal Arch Chapter permits the mark to be taken in either craft lodges or Royal Arch chapters, but in Ireland, it has to be taken in a mark lodge attached to a Royal Arch chapter. Now, some brethren have suggested that the situation in England and Wales really ought to have followed the Scottish or Irish pattern. What they may not understand is that the Scottish and Irish Supreme Grand Royal Arch chapters had not even been formed and had not taken the mark under the wings until after the Union of 1813. The Scottish Grand Chapter was formed in 1817, and it was only in the 1830s that they considered the mark to be an essential prerequisite for the Royal Arch. The Irish Grand Chapter was formed in 1829, but it wasn't until 1874 that they required the mark to be taken before the Royal Arch. Until 1931, the Irish Grand Lodge had not even recognised the mark or the Royal Arch. So, are you confused? I wouldn't blame you if you were. Perhaps I need to explain how what we have now came about. And it was through quirks of history rather than design. Let's face it, we wouldn't end up with what we have now if we'd started with a blank sheet of paper and tried to design it all from scratch. So let's go back to the early years of organised Freemasonry, shortly after the foundation of the Premier Grand Lodge in 1717. Now, back then, there were only the first and second degrees of craft masonry. The Master Mason's degree did not even exist until the 1720s, and it appears then to have been a new invention with no elements from operative practice. It includes traces of Elizabethan literature and a reworking of the story of the death of Noah into the story of the building of King Solomon's Temple. It was created, perhaps, to satisfy the expectations and aspirations of new members, including the educated and professional classes, as well as the aristocracy, who were then being introduced into our speculative lodges. So perhaps the second Duke of Montague and others were not satisfied to be simply fellows of the craft. The third degree also injected a higher level of morality, consistent with Enlightenment thinking of the age. The first reference to a Royal Arch came in Ireland more than 20 years later, but the records do not confirm that any degree ceremony had been worked. So Lawrence Dermot stated that he was made a Royal Arch Mason in Dublin in 1746, and in 1749, the Grand Lodge of Ireland issued warrants establishing 2 Royal Arch lodges. The earliest record of a Royal Arch degree ceremony in England features Thomas Dunkley, a name well known in Somerset, and he was made a Royal Arch Mason in Portsmouth in 1754. This was some 30 years after the Master Mason's degree emerged. Now, if the Master Mason's degree had been intended and designed to be incomplete, an early Master Mason would have to wait at least 30 years for the concluding part. And that strikes me, brethren, as absurd. Dr. Oliver, George Oliver, the famous Mason who invoked us all to make sure that we should be careful who we admit into our lodges, he suggested that the Royal Arch was created by removing part of the third degree. This is just not supported by an examination of 18th century rituals. Pritchard's 1730 expose, which is the earliest source of the text of the 3 craft degrees, as practiced by the Premier Grand Lodge, refers to the Mason's word, but it makes no reference to anything subsequently found in the Royal Arch. Prior to 1813, no craft ritual referred to the recovery of genuine secrets in the Royal Arch. In other words, brethren, there is no evidence that at their creation, the third degree and the Royal Arch degree had any link with each other whatsoever. So if the Royal Arch was not devised to be the completion of the Master Mason's degree, why was it created? Now, although the degree ceremony itself came from around 30 years after the Master Masons, elements of it are certainly much older. These elements, including the wearing of robes and the carrying of rods, staffs, or sceptres, relate to the true master masons of operative Freemasonry. In medieval times, the lodge was for the working mason. The medieval master mason was a member of the higher status local guild rather than the lodge. He was a professional, not a craftsman. He was a highly skilled architect, draftsman, and clerk of works all in one. The Royal Arch was originally restricted to past masters, and that's past P-A-S-S-E-D, masters of the craft. So is it possible that the Royal Arch was developed as a Masonic version of the admission of the true master mason, the higher status architect, into a guild? Is that why companions meet in chapters, the word used to describe the ruling assembly of a cathedral, rather than in a lodge? Another possibility is that the Royal Arch was devised to provide the allegorical basis for the discovery of our spiritual relationship with our Creator. And that's a theme picked up in another of my talks, What is Freemasonry's Fascination with Completion? Now, if we turn to the mark, the first part of this reflects old operative practices that date back at least as far as the organisation of Scottish lodges introduced by the Shaw Statutes in 1598. Some very early speculative lodges worked ceremonies that included elements of these practices. But again, that does not imply that a degree was conferred. The first record of a mark ceremony being worked in England dates to 1769, when the same Thomas Dunkley conferred the degrees of Mark Man and Mark Master on 6 Royal Arch companions. So let's think about this. Over a 50-year period, after the formation of the Premier Grand Lodge, between 1720 and 1769, there developed what have since become the major elements of today's speculative Freemasonry. And these were the Master Mason's degree, the installation ceremony, which I don't go into any further in this talk, the Mark and the Royal Arch degrees. These new degrees and ceremonies built on fragments of operative practices, but they also drew on stories, symbolism, and philosophies that were not previously present in Masonic ceremonies. However, the status of these degrees was controversial. Traditionalists had objected to the way in which the Premier Grand Lodge had made alterations and innovations to Freemasonry. So in 1751, representatives of 6 London lodges met and formed a rival Grand Lodge. Their Grand Secretary, Lawrence Dermot, nicknamed this Grand Lodge the Ancients, implying that it practiced Freemasonry in its original form. And from then on, the Premier Grand Lodge was known colloquially as the Moderns. And the 2 Grand Lodges developed very different views on the status of the Mark and the Royal Arch. The Ancients Grand Lodge embraced the Mark and the Royal Arch, and they authorised subordinate craft lodges to confer both degrees. The Premier Grand Lodge, or Moderns, wanted only the 3 craft degrees to be conferred in its lodges. Nevertheless, many of its lodges conducted Royal Arch ceremonies, and some also conducted the Mark. Eventually, in 1766, some Moderns Freemasons, led by the Grand Master, Lord Blaney, signed the Charter of Compact to form the excellent Grand and Royal Arch chapter of the Royal Arch of Jerusalem, to recognise and regulate the Royal Arch quite separate from their own craft Grand Lodge. By the end of the 18th century, despite the disputes between the rival Grand Lodges, the craft, Mark and Royal Arch had developed to become part of one common system. Despite their separate origins, the narratives of the degrees had become interlinked, and there were also many thematic and symbolic connections between them. Perhaps one reason for this is that at the centre of their development and promotion was one man, Thomas Dunkley. He had refined the ritual of the 3rd degree and that of the Royal Arch, and he also championed and enhanced the Mark. In fact, some have even suggested that he may have created the Mark. And of course, he's well known to you in Somerset, and I believe that Royal Cumberland Lodge still uses the Dunkley ritual. Since the 18th century, however, there have been many changes to our rituals, ceremonies, and governance. And the effect has been to take out elements of this one common system, leaving holes and gaps that have since been filled, I believe, by misunderstanding and confusion. At the Union of 1813, when the ancients and the moderns came together to form the United Grand Lodge of England, a compromise had to be found to accommodate the two Grand Lodges. Neither could be seen to lose face. To satisfy the moderns, reference had to be made to 3 degrees and no more. And the Royal Arch, if included, had to be conferred separately from lodges. To satisfy the ancients, there was no if. The Royal Arch had to be included. The wording of the declaration that has come down to us, amended as Burford tells us, was, to put it bluntly, a fudge. And that's Jim Daniels' words, the past Grand Secretary, not mine. It led to the suggestion that the Royal Arch was the concluding part of an unfinished Master Mason's degree, and yet no other jurisdiction has made this claim. As we have seen, in England and Wales, we now consider the craft and the Royal Arch as the two component parts of a third umbrella entity, pure ancient masonry. So how might the declaration be worded if we were to draft it using today's punctuation and without the sensitivities that divided the ancients and the moderns? It is declared and pronounced that pure ancient masonry consists of the 3 degrees of the craft, namely entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason, governed by United Grand Lodge of England, and that of the Holy Royal Arch, governed by Supreme Grand Chapter. 4 years after the union of the craft Grand Lodges, the Royal Arch was put under the jurisdiction of a new governing body. Although separate, this Supreme Grand Chapter was and remains led by the same principal officers who governed the United Grand Lodge. In addition, it was arranged that the chapters should be attached to lodges and carry the same number. The Craft and Royal Arch are 2 orders, but essentially the same organisation. So what happened to the mark? At the union of the ancients and moderns, it was omitted from this new system, although many lodges in England and Wales continue to work it. Perhaps to include it was simply pushing the compromise too far. This situation could not continue for long. After a Scottish Royal Arch chapter issued a charter for an English mark lodge, all agreed that a means had to be found to regularise the mark. In 1856, a new Grand Lodge of Mark Master Masons was formed to govern the degree, after the United Grand Lodge of England and Supreme Grand Chapter first considered incorporating the mark into the craft. Since then, in England and Wales, the mark and Royal Arch have been separate and distinct, each with their own independent governing bodies. However, despite being governed separately, because the craft mark and Royal Arch had evolved around the same time as part of one system, each degree now contains fragments of one story and symbolism. It is as if we have broken up a jigsaw. Unfortunately, some brethren now appear to confuse the allegorical story and its symbols as if it's real history. Some even use aspects of that story to justify a particular position or opinion. Remember, brethren, the ritual is like a film script. It tells a fictional story. Film scripts do not always tell the whole story chronologically. Other than the 3 degrees of the craft, it does not really matter whether we take degrees in the sequence of the story told in their traditional histories. What matters is the purpose behind the story and our individual journey of enlightenment. The purpose of our ritual is to convey a deeper meaning using symbols and allegory. And it's from exploring that deeper meaning that we learn to become better people. So in part 2 of this talk, I explore the narrative and symbolic links between these principles' degrees. In particular, I will focus on how the story of the craft degrees is continued in both the Mark and the Royal Arch to its conclusion, and the role of the keystone, an item alluded to in the craft, but which does not appear in any of its ritual or symbols. For now, I will conclude by saying it's only when you piece together the craft mark and the Royal Arch that you realise they're all part of the one same system, and that all of them are important for a fuller understanding of that system. So, brethren and companions, I certainly hope that that stimulates your Masonic curiosity. Thank you very much for your attention and interest. I'm now very happy to receive your questions, and I shall do my very best to answer them. So, Ian, I'm going to hand back to you now. Thank you very much indeed.
Right. Well, thank you very much indeed, Tony. I think that was very thought stimulating and very informative for all present. In fact, I am beginning to wonder whether it's struck most of the members dumb, because we only had one question, or I only had one question forthcoming during that. And it was a question from Ray Guthrie. And Ray said, Jim Daniels called the Article 2 declaration the Sussex Fudge. Do you agree with that?
Oh, well, absolutely, Ray. Ray, can you just wave at me just so I know where you are? I like to sort of direct my answers rather back to people.
Over here, Tony.
Well, I don't know where here is because my screen looks very different from yours. Ray, thank you. It was absolutely a fudge, and I referred to that in the talk. In fact, I had read Jim's paper before it was submitted to Freemasonry Today. And in fact, a shortened version of this talk is going to appear, as I say, in June, in the June edition of Freemasonry Today. And that reflects the fact, brethren, that there is a great deal of interest, particularly in Supreme Grand Chapter, in trying to explain better the relationship here, particularly between, of course, the craft and the Royal Arch. It was a fudge. It was a compromise in order to bring together two what appeared to be diametrically opposed opinions. They had a golden opportunity. Both orders by this time, both Grand Lodges by this time, were headed by royal princes, the brothers Kent and Sussex. And under their leadership, they wanted to merge. It'd been on the cards for some time, but there were these impossible differences. There were also political things that were happening at the same time. It wasn't too long after an act of Parliament that attempted to ban Freemasonry, and there was a number of actions which we had to take in order to secure our future. And so it was absolutely vital that the two Grand Lodges united and combined into one. And so a means had to be found. And what they did was that they created this idea of pure ancient masonry, but they fudged this compromise. And the only way of handling it was by suggesting that the Royal Arch was part of something that already existed. They created it, actually, pure ancient masonry, and by connecting Royal Arch chapters to lodges. And that's something that I go into a little bit more in another talk. It was certainly a fudge. It's not what we would do if we were starting with it today. And it has caused all this confusion over the years. But bear in mind what I said. I'll just finish with this point and hand back to Ian. There was no suggestion at the time that the Royal Arch completed the third degree. That's not what it says. And the earliest suggestion that the Royal Arch completed the third degree that I can find comes from 1834. So that wasn't the original intention at all. Thank you, Ian. And thank you, Ray. That was a good question.
Thank you, Tony.
Right, Tony, we have another one from David Madden. And David Madden says, as a mark degree, it's very much part of the craft. Why is a mark jewel not worn in a craft lodge like a chapter jewel?
Well, David, thank you for the question. I'm not certain I agree with you that the mark is part of the craft. In fact, I don't. It is an extension to. The mark actually is 2 degrees. It's the degree of Mark Man and the degree of Mark Master Mason. And what happens in the Mark Man ceremony, without giving too much away to those of you who are not Mark Master Masons, what happens in the Mark Man ceremony is that a fellow craft receives his own mark, which he uses to indent or to engrave on a stone that he prepares his own personal mark. And that is used in order to identify or to link that stone to him, and it enables him to be paid for that work. That is quite clearly links to operative practice. That is what operative Freemasons did, operative stonemasons did. And you could quite legitimately say that that perhaps could have been part of the fellowcraft degree. And you can certainly call it as an extension or a continuation of the fellowcraft degree. The Mark Master Mason's degree has no link to the fellowcraft degree. It's very close actually to the Master Mason's degree. Again, without going into too much detail, what the Mark Master Mason's degree describes is the preparation of a stone that was needed for the completion of the temple. Now, if you think about the Master Mason's degree, what we're talking, we're at the events happening around the time, very close in time to the completion of the temple. The three ruffians were so concerned that they were not going to be promoted and entrusted with the secrets of as a Master Mason, that they accosted Hiram Abiff because the temple was about to be completed. So the events of the degree of Mark Master Mason and the events of the degree of Master Mason happened very closely in time. So I don't think of the mark as part of the craft. I believe that it is an additional story that enhances our understanding of the craft. Certainly, it's all part of the one system, but the craft is 3 degrees plus the installation ceremony, of course. So I don't consider it to be part of the mark. Now, moving on to your second part, the reason the mark jewel is not worn in a craft lodge is that the mark jewel comes from a completely separate and independent organization. And this again is where we sometimes get a little confused. Freemasonry is not an organization. Freemasonry is a system of thinking, if you like. Within Freemasonry, there are many organizations, many sovereign bodies. So United Grand Lodge of England is a sovereign body. It creates its rules, its membership systems and structures, and it governs itself. Supreme Grand Chapter is a sovereign body. It happens to be closely related to the craft, and I think of it as the two sides of the same coin. The Grand Lodge of Mark Master Masons is a completely separate body. It has a separate constitution, a separate governance, a separate legal entity. There's absolutely no reason, therefore, or justification why your membership of that organization, as shown by your breast jewel or my breast jewel, as I'm a Mark Master Mason, of course, why I would consider wearing that with the regalia of another organization. So we've got to remember that these are separate organizations, all fitting underneath this panoply of this wonderful thing called Freemasonry. Thank you for the question, David.
Right, we have one here from Malcolm Toogood. And Malcolm says, in 18th century Bath minutes, we have references to the making of Scots Masters. Which element does that refer to?
Scots Masters, I'm not an expert in this particular area, but I believe it's linked into the Scottish Rite, or what we in this country call the ancient and accepted rite. But bear in mind that the 18th century was a period where so many different degrees were being developed. And again, I come back to what I was saying a minute ago. We have to distinguish between an order, which is an organization, and degrees, which are ceremonies, which lead to a status. And if we confuse degrees and orders, we get ourselves really mixed up. Now, what was happening in the 18th century was that these degrees were developing, and some of them were clustering together to form orders, and some of them were moving here, there, and everywhere. So we know that there were people who were developing, particularly from a European influence, who were developing rite systems, and the ancient and accepted rite, what we call Rose Croix, but is actually the ancient and accepted rite, developed out of that. And I believe that Scots Masters, if you like, found its way into that. Now, if you look at the intermediate degrees in the ancient and accepted rite, there's a lot of those which have very similar degrees in other degree systems. There are some which have close relationships to the order of the Allied Masonic degrees. So what you've got is degrees that, if you like, clustered together to form orders in some cases. In other cases, were left a little bit abandoned or were not strong enough on their own. And the talk I gave last night about Royal Ark Mariners is a case in point. It developed, but it didn't really take root as an organisation. It wasn't strong enough as an organisation. And much later, it was eventually adopted. So I think Scots Masters was something that was developing around that time and eventually found its way into ancient and accepted rite, or at least the Scottish rite version of that. Somebody may be able to put me right on that, but thank you for the question, Malcolm.
Right, well, we have one here from Paul Dickin, and Paul Dickin says, in 1717, when there were only 2 degrees, were they roughly equivalent to the first 2 degrees today, or has some material been shifted around?
This is a fantastic question. Whereabouts is Paul? Hi, Paul. There is some very good evidence that some material was shifted around. If you read Samuel Pritchard's expose of 1730, Masonry Dissected, there is a lot that we now see in the 3rd degree that didn't exist in that at the time, but it did have things like the 5 points of fellowship. And there's a lot of evidence that some aspects of the 2nd degree were taken and used to form part of the 3rd. So there was a little bit of editing going on, if you like, to sort of try to make some adjustments. But it was very clear that prior to the 1720s, there were only 2 degrees. And those degrees weren't what we would be familiar with today. They were, the initiation was very quick. It was almost a formality. And lodges tended to meet around a table, which is one of the reasons that we square a lodge today. The exact composition, it's very difficult to pull it all apart, because we have in those early years just 3 sources of ritual: Pritchard's, and then almost 30 years later, you had J&B, and then there was another one which came very shortly afterwards. So we have very little documentary evidence of what they actually practiced as part of their degrees. And Pritchard's expose was that, an expose. So we don't really know what his agenda was and whether he distorted anything. So it's very, very difficult. But there is strong belief that the 3rd degree did take some elements from the 2nd. And then, of course, later, others who developed the ritual, including William Preston, added lots of other bits to it. Thank you.
Right, well, we have one here from Mike McLean. And Mike McLean says, you say a fellow craft can pass through to mark man. Does that mean that you don't need to be a master mason to take or join the mark?
Now, again, we're confusing, aren't we, the story and the events with the organisation. So in every constitution, the mark is only conferred on people who are already master masons. In our constitution, the Grand Lodge are mark master masons. The qualification for becoming a member of the mark, and you do that by one ceremony which has 2 degrees, mark man immediately followed by mark master mason. You have to be a master mason. What I'm saying is that the degree of mark man as conferred is a logical extension to what happens in the fellowcraft, because the fellowcraft is the qualifying degree. The fellowcraft is when the mason, the operative mason, has qualified to work for himself, to be released from his apprenticeship, to be able to earn his own living, earn his own income, and therefore he was paid for his work. An entered apprentice was not paid for his work. He relied upon his master to look after him. So the award of a mark followed the fact that you became a qualified mason. But let's not confuse that with our organizational structure. And in every constitution, you have to first be a master mason before you can be advanced into the mark. Thank you.
Right, we have one from Michael Norton, And Michael asks, were any other orders worked in lodges around the early 1800s that didn't make the cut, or was it just the three?
Well, the moderns preferred or just thought of the craft as being the 3 degrees. So that was what they brought to the table in 1813. They said, no, our lodges can only work the 3 degrees. The ancients empowered their lodges under their warrants to work many other degrees. And as I said earlier, there were degrees that were sort of being developed, and some of which took root and some of which didn't. And it was a time of huge change, a lot of creativity, a lot of new thinking. Thomas Dunkley was at the heart of that. Later, William Preston was at the heart of that. Lawrence Dermott was at the heart of that. Thomas Dunkley was very clever, actually. He was a modern mason who also built great relations with the ancients and was very acceptable to the ancients. And how he managed to develop other degrees, given that he owed his first allegiance to the moderns, is really a tribute to his powers of diplomacy and influence. So it was a time of great change. And it was very clear that in order to get through 1813, the moderns had to come out with a smile, and the ancients had to too. So the moderns had this statement that there are 3 degrees and no more. And the ancients came out with the fact that the Royal Arch was included in something. And the word is included. That is the word in the 1813 statement. What it was included in, of course, was pure ancient masonry. So they created this umbrella to fit the two together and to create this indissoluble link between the craft and the Royal Arch. And that is unique. It's only in the English Constitution that we have that. But it's because of that particular set of circumstances that we had here. It's not because of the sequence of the story. It's not because of anything to do with the narrative or the symbolism. It was purely in order to enable that union to take place, which had to take place. Otherwise, Freemasonry itself was at threat.
Right. We've got one from David Mason. And David says, if the Royal Arch degree is not the completion of the Master Mason's degree, why do we encourage new Master Masons to join the Royal Arch before anything else?
This is a fantastic question, and I thank you for asking it, because you've put your finger on something that a lot of people really want to understand. As soon as we take out this idea of the Royal Arch being the completion of the 3rd degree, then what is it? Well, it's the completion of the journey that we began with initiation. It's the completion of pure ancient masonry. So it makes sense for us to say, well, look, let's encourage people to make sure they complete that. I often think of it as the craft is the basic course, the Royal Arch is the advanced course, and all the other degrees are like electives that we can pick and choose according to our interests, our curiosity, our inclination, if you like. There is no such link in other jurisdictions, but the position of United Grand Lodge of England and Supreme Grand Chapter is that we should encourage all brethren to join the Royal Arch before joining anything else. Now, what brethren choose to do, of course, is their choice. They're free spirits, they're volunteers, they're joining membership organizations. So they will make their own choice. My personal position is that we should encourage all Master Masons to join both the Mark and the Royal Arch, because that then, if you like, provides these 3 principal orders within Freemasonry. It provides them with that core, that foundation. If they want to join anything else, that will help embellish it. But the Mark and the Royal Arch are so complementary. And when you listen to the second talk, you'll hear how things that happen in the Mark help us make sense of the Royal Arch and vice versa. But the position in England and Wales is that because of the constitutional link, because they're part of the same organization, and because the Royal Arch is considered the completion of pure ancient masonry, we encourage people to join that first. And certainly that's the position of United Grand Lodge of England. It's to encourage Master Masons to join the Royal Arch first before joining anything else. So you've got to look at it you've got to consider it from different angles. If you're considering it from UGLE and Supreme Grand Chapter, that's their position. If you're considering it from other angles, you might come up with another position. My position is, unfortunately, people who want a distinct answer to which should you join first are probably driving a wedge, and I don't like that. I want the two orders to work together, and I want all brethren to benefit from them, because I think they're great and I think they're complementary. And as we've seen tonight, the fact that they can work together is enhancing to all of us. So I'm always very concerned about the attempts by some brethren to drive a wedge, to suggest it's either or. And that's why I always suggest to Master Masons that they find time and plan for joining both at some point. Thank you for the question.
Right. Well, we've got one here. I'm jumping around in the order of these questions a bit. We've got one from Richard Walter to everyone. And he says, so if a Master Mason cannot receive his wages until his work can be identified, shouldn't Mark be joined before becoming a Master Mason?
If you took everything in a logical sequence, you'd end up with a very different situation to you have today. If we wanted to purely straighten out everything in the story, the narrative in our degrees is only there to enable us to moralize on them, to draw some symbolic or some meaning from the symbolism. The stories are allegorical. They're not factual. They're not historical. So if we tried to straighten everything out, we would find that we would have something which would be very different, and it would be very difficult to try to do that. And I'm not actually certain that it would benefit us. I rather enjoy, for example, films in which I'm jumping backwards and forwards along the timeline. I like flashbacks. My latest talk is called Back to the Future, because I'm looking at Freemasonry in the past and I'm thinking about Freemasonry in the future. And I quite like jumping backwards and forwards and looking at things from those different perspectives. So there might be a logic in what you suggest, but you see, the truth is the craft never did include the conferring of the mark into craft ritual. It's never been part of the craft ritual. It never was in the 18th century, let alone the 19th. It's always been part of the mark, and therefore it's owned by the mark. And therefore, for one membership organization to say to another, oh, by the way, can you come along and do something for us? And then off you go and we'll carry on. Wouldn't make sense, would it? So in terms of a logical sequence, it might make sense, but in terms of how the degrees developed and the organizations developed, it doesn't fit. And to try to retrofit it now would be, I suspect, quite damaging and unnecessary. But thanks, a really good question.
Right, we have one from Tony Guthrie, and Tony says, do you have an opinion about what happened, or most likely happened, in 1856 when craft were considering including the Mark degree and then seemed to drop the idea completely, leading to the formation of Mark Grand Lodge in June of that year?
Yes, I do. And I've looked at some of the original documents. In fact, the original documents nowadays are in the minutes of what happened. And I've looked at those, and I've also read the authorized histories of both United Grand Lodge, which was published in 1967, incidentally, and of Mark Grand Lodge. And I believe that what happened was, first, it's important to understand the context. The Mark at the time, it wasn't long after the death of the Duke of Sussex, he tried to sort of freeze out other orders and other degrees. He was head of them, but he didn't foster them. And a lot of them floundered in that time. In the early 1850s, a Scottish Royal Arch chapter issued a warrant to found a Mark Lodge in London. It was against Scottish Grand Chapter's rules and regulations. And the lodge was sent, the chapter in Aberdeen actually, was censured, and eventually it closed, but not for some time. And there then began to grow a number of early Mark lodges, which were separate from the craft, and which owed their allegiance, if you like, to this Royal Arch chapter in Aberdeen. That's against all Masonic protocol. One constitution can't establish a subsidiary unit on another constitution's territory. It was against all protocol, and something had to be done to regularize the mark. So they looked at what could we do? And this idea came up, well, let's incorporate it into the craft. And actually in March 1856 at the quarterly communication, that minute, or that proposition rather, was agreed. Before the June quarterly communication, a lot of discussion took place, and it was clear that it was considered that that was the wrong approach, that wouldn't work, that would actually undermine the union. It would fracture Freemasonry. So what was another solution? Now, I think there is another solution that they could have taken. And I'll tell you what it is in a minute. But I believe the solution they took, and having looked at all the original documents, the solution they took was to found a separate, independent, sovereign Grand Lodge to govern the mark. And the first Grand Master of that was Lord Lee, a close friend of the Craft Grand Master of the time, a close friend, and the provincial Grand Master for Warwickshire. And in the early days, all of the people who were senior in that came from that original lodge that was founded in London. And they were all senior Freemasons, all senior craft masons. So it was not a schism. It wasn't a, well, if you're going to do that, we'll go off and we'll do this. I think it was an arranged and agreed approach to provide stability and to provide a proper home for the mark. And then, of course, it took on a life of its own. It had to grow in strength. It had to establish its independence. And it still demonstrates, despite very, very close relations, my personal view is that a better solution at the time, and I'm not suggesting we do this now, and it would be impossible to do it now. There's too many complications. But a better solution at the time, I think, would have been to incorporate the mark, not into the craft, but into Supreme Grand Chapter, not into the Royal Arch, but to bring it under the governance of Supreme Grand Chapter. And of course, that is what has happened in other jurisdictions. So we'd be in a very different position if that was the case now. Thanks for the, of course, what I don't know is why they didn't do that, because it seems so obvious to me, but there we go. Of course, I want it to be understood that I'm a loyal member of all three orders. Indeed, I'm a Grand Officer in all three orders. And you know, I'm not suggesting that we should try to engineer a change in that now. I think what we have to do is work together with what we have and enhance what we have. Good. Thanks for the question. Back to you, Ian.
Right. Well, as things stand, I have one more, and that's from Craig Harding. And Craig asks, if the three orders of craft, mark, and chapter are part of the same story and ideas, should it not be one single membership organization and one subscription rather than a primary subscription with secondary or bolt-on subscriptions attached to it?
Thank you for that. And, you know, if we were devising it from scratch, that probably be what we would do. If we were devising it from scratch, our membership numbers would be low. We wouldn't be creating multiple organizations, would we? In fact, in women's Freemasonry, that's pretty much what happens. It's one membership organization, and they follow a sequence of degrees in a particular order. And in fact, that is what is known as a Masonic rite, a rite, R-I-T-E. And there are a number of Masonic rites around the world. There's the Ancient and Accepted Rite, there's the Swedish Rite, there's the York Rite. And all of these systems follow a linear path. And that linear path means that whatever your interest and inclination, you've got to take those degrees in that particular order. I rather like this quirky English, what apparently looks like a haphazard system, because what it allows us to do is to do what I said earlier: take the basic course, take the advanced course, and complete the electives. So I've chosen to join certain orders. I enjoy those orders. I'm intrigued and interested by other orders, and at different times I've joined different orders, but I don't have to join them in a laid down answer. Nobody's turning around to me and saying, you've got to join all of these, 12 or 30 or however many degrees or follow them in a particular sequence. So I can chart my own route by the system that we have. Now, if we were much smaller, and I'm touching here on another thread of my writing and research and talks, if our membership decline continued for another 40 years, another 50 years maybe, we might be in a position where we couldn't sustain multiple organizations, and we might have to look at it from a different perspective again. But the fact that they are separate at the moment, I think, gives us a certain degree of choice rather than creating a right system, which I don't think would really suit many of us in any case. So that's my take on the question that you asked, which is a perfectly reasonable question. But we got to where we are through quirks of history, through events not happening in a logical order, and through some one or two crisis moments which were addressed in a particular way at the particular time. Thanks for the question, Craig. Back to you, Ian.
Right, well, that seems to be all that we have at the moment on the question and answer session via chat. So really, I think I should hand back to David Medlock now.
Thank you much, Ian, and thank you very much, Tony. That was very stimulating. It's actually not changed any of my views, but it has reinforced certain ideas which I have. I'd just like to comment on what Stuart Galway said on the chat system there. It's given him an appetite, and I'm looking forward to learning more on the history and the links between the craft mark and the Holy Royal Arch. And thank you very much. And if you succeed in doing nothing else tonight, I think that sums up exactly what I wanted to get out of it. And I just appreciate how much time you've given us and the succinct way in which you delivered that lecture. And I hope it does stimulate a lot more interest in the other parts of masonry apart from just craft masonry. I would like to remind the brethren, there's been 180, I think 184 on the list, that if they are like-minded to support Tony in his endeavours for the charity, that there is a Just Giving page, and I certainly will be heading that way and making a gesture, because I think it's well worth everybody knowing that it has been appreciated, and that I hope you do carry on giving this lecture further into your career. On behalf of everybody, Tony, I thank you very much. It was much appreciated, and I'm looking forward to seeing your next part of the lecture in March. Thank you very much.
Sir David, thank you very much indeed. That's I'm really quite touched by what you've said, and if it's achieved what you've suggested, then it's achieved my objective too, because I love all three orders, and I love it when we can work together, which is what you're doing in Somerset. So thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for what you've said, and thank you, brethren, for your interest and for your attendance and for your engagement with what I think are wonderful questions.